I have one at 7:45. Let me share this one.
Thank you. That looks great.
That looks good. Yay.
Yes.
Yay.
My 5-year-old in kindergarten, we've been talking about a lot about school buses, and my kids have gotten very involved too. All of the school age kids have presented to the school board about their concerns. And that picture on the right is my 5-year-old who we've been talking so much about school buses that she drew colored a school bus at school. So I thought that was a good one to include. It's been on a lot of children's minds as their families have been talking about it and as their families have been trying to figure out plans for the upcoming school year. So I'm going to talk about what the policy changes are, again, how they happened without community input. And now I'm going to talk about equity concerns and safety concerns that have been overwhelming throughout the community. And then finally, I'm going to end with our petition, which we do have a proposed solution. We had another petition a few weeks ago that we sent out, and now we're actually, that was actually asking for more answers and more communication from the school board. And now we're actually asking the school board for a specific change that I'll talk about at the end. And there's a QR code. If anyone would like to participate in our petition, we definitely need all the support we can get. We're a grassroots movement, we're not, and we all do this as a volunteer effort. So we don't have any paid people on our team or anything like that. All right, so that's the overview. Next slide. So how we decide which in Howard County, who gets school buses and who does not get school buses is Transportation Policy 5200. There was last year in May of 2022 a unanimous board decision to change this policy significantly, and there was never a public hearing. So typically the protocol for policy changes when they're significant is to include some form of public input. And for whatever reason, the board chose not to. When you look at their policy, it is recommended that you have a public hearing, but it is not the way it's worded. It could not be held. There's no legal implication if they chose not to have a public hearing. So they made a change. There was never a public hearing. And the actual changes were not shown to families or implemented really until March of this year. So a couple of days before spring break, families received an email that was very vague. The title was vague. It said non-transportation areas for the 23-24 school year. So distance changes for pre-K students. It used to be that anyone who was over half a mile would get a school bus. Now you have to be over a mile away. From kindergarten to grade 5, your elementary school children, that has always been a mile, but they significantly changed it. So now it's more than a mile, but the language is still, it's a mile. For middle schoolers, it went from 1 mile to 1.5 miles. For high schoolers, it went from 1.5 to 2 miles. But the other thing that changed significantly was how the measurements were being made, particularly for the elementary school children. It used to be that the distance was calculated by how far it would be for you to walk from your front door to the front door of the school. And now per policy changes, they take you from the property line of your apartment complex or condominium unit, which can be pretty extended from the front door, to the property line of the school that's closest to your home. So even though kindergarten to grade 5 students the idea was pitched as everything's the same for elementary, it actually affected a lot of students, so that now more than 1/3 of the total school bus cuts, as you might be hearing people in the community concerns being raised, more than 1/3 are actually affecting elementary age school children. That's over 1,000 children suddenly do not have school bus service that had it before. Next slide. The part of the policy is not that is being implemented differently is not new policy. So in that they're extending where it's convenient boundaries beyond that 1 mile or beyond that 1.5 mile. I have a few maps to show you all. Language that was new is that the transportation office may at its sole discretion. So this is very authoritarian. They can go in and just say, we don't feel like covering your neighborhood, and so we're not going to. adjust if deemed necessary to ensure the overall efficiency of the school bus routes. And this bothers a lot of families because you never in a school classroom say, well, for efficiency, we're not gonna teach this child. You're trying to cover, you're trying to include everyone. But in this situation, they will if a neighborhood extends pretty far back, most of the neighborhood is less than a mile. They want to cut the whole neighborhood from service. Even homes that are 1.3 miles away won't get covered. Next slide. The other thing that it does is it significantly changes how far away a bus stop can be from home. And people do not realize this yet because they have not told the public how they're implementing this part of the policy. So this prior school year, bus stops were no more than half a mile from home. So a lot of families would have a quarter mile or more to get to their bus stop, but it was never more than a half mile for a standard bus stop. Bus stops now can be as far as 1 mile away for elementary school students, 1.5 miles away from home for middle schoolers, 2 miles away for home for high schoolers. And those locations won't be known until August. So as I start to talk about some of the concerns that people have raised about safety and equity, those problems are going to be compounded if they truly implement the policy and push these bus stops as far back as they're allowed to. And based on the way they've made school bus cuts, we do think that it is likely that they intend to use these much more liberal bus stop locations in terms of how far away they are from home. Next up. Thank you. They added mandatory school bus registration, which I've spoken of before. I actually think this is a good part of the policy. It asks for people to register for school bus service. The deadline was June 1st. They extended it to June 15th. They finally did get 95% of kids to fill out, or families to fill out, whether or not they plan to use bus service. And then they made the assumption that those 5% that did not, what they're telling the public is that they make the assumption that those 5% who did not register, they will give them service. So there were a lot of concerns that those kids, if you didn't sign up in time, that you would suddenly lose your school bus service. It seems like that's not the intention or the way they're implementing that part of the policy. It's not part of the policy that I'm personally concerned about. I think it helps us efficiently use resources in the community. Next slide. So I wanted to show a little bit more information about who this affects. So next slide. As a board certified pediatrician, I have big concerns that there is a disproportionate effect on Title I schools versus other schools. So there's a list of schools that are affected in with non-transportation areas. So I'm sorry, this is a list of all schools. And then if there's 1 star by the school, that means they have a new non-transportation area, which means there is going to be less bus service next year for that school than there was this past year. And if there's no star by that name, the school, it means that that school is not affected. If there's 2 stars by that school's name, it means it's not affected as well, but 2 stars implies that those schools don't actually have any non-transportation area. So as you look at it, the schools in a lot of these schools are in the western part of Howard County, not Title I schools. So you have Manners Woods Elementary, you have Tri-Adelphia Ridge, you have West Friendship, you have Bushy Park, and you have Dayton Oaks. And for many people who understand that the way schools work, those are not the Title I, or understand the schools in Howard County, the map of where these schools are. Those are not where our higher free and reduced meal program student recipients are. And so there's concern that, again, that the schools that are most affected are the ones who are the least likely to be able to afford private transportation or help in the event of bad weather. The schools where there is more chronic absenteeism and other concerns. So which elementary schools are affected? I made red boxes around the Title I schools that are affected. There are 9 out of 13, I'm sorry, the red box is around all the Title I schools. 9 out of 13 Title I elementary schools are affected, so that's 69% versus 48% of our non-Title I elementary schools. So equity is a huge concern in this whole policy change. When we initially raised this concern, the week after spring break, we held a small protest, and from the beginning, we raised concerns that the children who would be most affected were the ones that didn't really have a good way out. And when the board pressed to the transportation office, was equity assessed? Indeed, equity had never been assessed for any of these policy changes, and that's been publicly on the record. So a lot of concern just when you're creating such a big policy change that you didn't even in the beginning think about which children this would affect most, who could potentially be harmed. And in this case, we do think that the kids that are going to be harmed most are the ones who are least able to afford a change. Next slide. So there was a lovely article in the Wild Lake High School newspaper that someone shared with me this week. It took the non-transportation area map. So the school provided what's highlighted in black, the school provided that. And then the red on top, those are annotations from the Wild Lake writer, Amy Manzanares, and whoever else was working with her on this story. What this shows is that as there are areas where so 2 miles is the walk radius for a high school, but as you can see, there's areas where it extends 2.3 or 2.1 miles, and the only way to know what the new parts of the non-transportation zones are is to manually go in and compare it to last year's bus locator records. So this actually takes quite a bit of work to go in manually and add addresses in and figure out on a map how far away they are. And Jake, I think I'm actually going to have you, just for sake of time, kind of push through the next few slides. There's a lot of maps that I'm willing to show people later. You're welcome to go through, but lots of schools, not just one, are affected beyond that radius. So the next couple slides, Jake, if you don't mind, so Clarksville Elementary has a large, actually pause here for a second. So hazard buses, so that's what Howard County calls buses to areas without a reasonably safe walking route to school, will continue. Some of them were canceled. That's a separate problem. But sidewalks are not required. So there are neighborhoods where there are not sidewalks, and students are still required to walk extended distances on non-sidewalk, so in the road, to get to school. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. River Hill, there's an area going 2.7 miles to the high school that a lot of folks were concerned about. Next slide. So safety concerns, we have a lot of safety concerns. One of them is that we already have a lot of students who are being driven to school from the current walk zone. So some families choose to drive even in the shorter distances. So as you increase the walk radius, more children who have access to a private vehicle will use one. And a lot of the car rider loops are already overwhelmed with safety concerns. Our local middle school had a child struck in the car pickup line this past spring, and it was very traumatic for everyone who witnessed. Luckily, the child did okay, but this is not something that we want to promote continuation of in the future, just some of the safety concerns. And so suddenly adding more vehicles to these problems without solutions is a concern. There will be more children walking and cycling extended distances for timed intervals where potential predators could be waiting for them or watching and knowing the routes that these children are taking. And this happens even in poor weather. And so it gives a very easy way for a stranger to approach a child and say, hey, it's raining, don't you want to ride to school? And in bad weather, it certainly makes a child more vulnerable to harm. The new non-transportation areas were not physically examined for safety. So some hazard buses were canceled. So again, those school buses that used to go to areas where there was concern, or they go to areas where there's not a good walking route. Some of them were removed without a physical inspection of the actual route. And then the current process, so the school is now advertising because of all these safety concerns. They're saying, hey, go walk your route and tell us if there's any safety concerns. But the current process requires that the child have an advocate to speak out for them. And if they don't, then their walking route will not physically get assessed for safety. And then the pediatrician in me is really concerned that what's going to happen is the same thing that happened during the pandemic, but I think an even more dangerous way, is that we're going to have more unsupervised children. And that's going to increase the risk of child death. So more than a third of the bus cuts affect elementary school children. In Maryland, leaving a child under the age of 8 is considered neglect. But then to prevent death from a vehicle collision with a pedestrian, it is recommended that children under 10 even have someone walk with them to school. And then a supervising caregiver would need to walk almost 5 miles from some of these new extended distances per day. So it'd be 1.2 miles to go to school, 1.2 miles to get back. And then again, you would repeat that in the afternoon to pick up the child. And when you're talking about families who are on hourly wage jobs, they can't afford the time to do that, and they don't have the money to hire someone to drive the kid. So in many cases, we predict that what happened during the pandemic for some of those families is they would leave a child unsupervised at a house to do their online learning. And similarly, we think that this will happen for some of these children who are now suddenly walkers, who families for years have relied on transportation. Next slide. So there's a lot of unknowns about school bus contractors for the next year. There's a big company from $1 billion company from California called Zum that was hired for most of the bus routes. Supposedly there's going to be some more information this week. I haven't heard anything. I don't have an insider scoop on any of what's going on behind the scenes, but our local bus contractors were basically not, there was a lot, most of the contracts for next year most of the bus routes have been given to this large $1 billion company, and the prior bus contractors have been left out of the loop in terms of that new contracts and what's going to happen for the new school year. Next slide. So our proposed solution is that there have been overwhelming safety concerns presented by the community, by many people from many schools. And we also have many concerns about equity. And so we are recommending that we know that the school board, when you read their policy on making policies, policy 2020, we read that the school board believes that any sound policy requires public input. And because the public has come forward, we were never given a chance to speak out before the policy was made. Now we are speaking out. We believe that the bare minimum that the board can do, and what we think they should do, is to suspend all bus cuts for at least 1 year, find a way to make that happen. And during that 1 year, we want them to better assess safety for all the new non-transportation areas. We want them to physically assess routes for children, even those that don't have advocates, with parents calling the transportation office with safety concerns. And then we also never had a chance for the public to have input, and we would like there to be public brainstorming for alternative solutions that don't require any bus cuts. And then after that committee convenes, we'd like to have a public hearing for public input. And that is actually part of that second piece, is also promoting safety, because school buses, per the National Highway Safety Traffic Administration, are the safest way for children to get to school. So if you cut school bus service, you are decreasing child safety, whether you are creating a bad route or there's other safety concerns beyond that, but just cutting access to school bus will decrease safety in our county. So we think that the public should be part of the brainstorming process to think of any other alternatives that the school system could pursue before they choose that route. And we don't have a very long timeline. July 13th is the last board meeting before the new school year. So we think if they're going to act, they need to act now in order to prevent harm. Last slide, Jake. So we have a QR code that you can use to read the petition. And I encourage all of you to think about signing it and also to share it with your friends, colleagues, coworkers, organizations that you might be a part of. We do have a Twitter account and we have a Facebook page. I'm mostly the one writing and posting on those accounts. And I'm happy to take any questions or discussion.
And you'll be marching in the 4th of July parade tomorrow,
I
right?
am. That's where your 4th of July. Don't kiss school bus service goodbye. So we've made over 2,000 little handouts that have a little Hershey's kiss on them that we will be passing around the River Hill Community Association, the village. They invited us to march in the parade. So there'll be about 13 of us that'll be marching with posters and handing out QR codes, trying to get the word out.
Okay, we have a few questions. I think Yvonne had her hand up first, so go ahead.
Okay, so I don't know whether you know the answer to this, but at some point, the county probably had their own buses and their own drivers. So do you know when they shifted over to hiring private companies to outsourcing this?
I don't know the history of that. I know in recent history, there are local private contractors, and they have relied on Howard County for their work. And they've bought school buses, they've invested in infrastructure to keep those buses running. And a lot of them, if you read the local newspaper stories that have been running, a lot of the school bus contractors feel that they have been harmed by this new contract with an out-of-state company.
So because, well, I worked for many, many years in Prince George's County. And of course, they don't contract out the buses. I'm not saying there are no problems, but the bus drivers are employees of the county school system. And they negotiate their own contract, and the buses belong to the school system. I'm supposing that to contract out the service costs more money than to have your own drivers and your own buses. That's why I asked the question as to when. I'm almost positive that they started out with their own buses and their own drivers. So it'll be interesting to find out. Because now they're spending a lot of money on this new company. Probably costs more than even the local
It
ones.
does cost more. It does.
There you go. So that's why they're now making the cuts.
That is
I mean, it
that is
just
one
doesn't make
concern a lot of
sense.
families have of if we're spending what's been reported in the newspapers is Zoom is getting $17,000 per route versus about $75,000 per route, which is what local contractors have gotten in the past. And local contractors say that they have asked for a raise to $85,000 per route so that they could provide better wages to their workers. And Howard County public school system came back and said that was too expensive historically, as recently as this within the last 12 months. And so families are looking at the news saying, why are you picking this more expensive company? There's still a lot that many of us feel like has not been answered. And when the board and when the school system have been asked in public meetings, they allude to mediation that they're undergoing with the government. I'm sorry, with with these contractors, and the bus contractors are saying that no mediation is going on right now. So it's not clear to me. I think these discussions are happening behind the scenes, and I'm unfortunately not privy to the details of any of that.
So I
I'm
just
hoping
want to
we'll-
add one more thing.
Sure.
Normally, and I would think even in the surrounding counties, and Kat, you may know what's going on in Montgomery County, but normally the amount that a student can walk is 1 mile. You go over the mile and a bus comes to get you. 1 mile. So I'm surprised, shocked more that it's going over 2 miles, 2 or more. Because that's
So for the-
crazy for an elementary school child.
Yeah, so the elementary school students, it's over a mile. So they're adding, some students will get service if they're a little over a mile, and some elementary school students, because of their location in a neighborhood, they're cutting you even 1.3 miles away from the elementary school. High schoolers are the ones who are being cut 2 miles, but then it's beyond, as I showed on the Wild Lake map, the River Hill map. That is the worst policy in the state. Montgomery County and PG County use 2 miles, but they don't extend it the way that Howard County is extending it. And they also go door to door. They don't do property line to property line, which adds significant distance as well. So there are counties that use more than a mile, but now for high school, we're actually going to be the worst the way we're implementing the policy.
All right, I'm gonna go to the next person. Looks like Sarah has a question.
So, our children, even the best and brightest, haven't been taught not to hitchhike. I know that this sounds really silly, but I've been asked for rides from the young ladies to high school. I probably look like a nice lady, but like hitchhiking is still a deal, and we need to take that into consideration. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
And the schools just don't teach that anymore. Like, don't hitchhike.
And I would go a step further. So it's not just don't hitchhike, don't create a situation where a child really wants to hitchhike. So if you are so tired of walking 2 miles and it's raining, you're going to ask for help sometimes, or accept help, even if you're like, oh, are they safe or not? For better or worse,
People have
some
looked at me
children will
and
do that.
like young ladies. I mean, it was just one time, but a young lady looked at me and she was like, "Can you give me a ride to school?" And it was just like, are you serious? Like, sure, but like, I mean, it was just a few years ago, and I was just like, do you know not to ask that? And then too, me and my son, we walked to school to Worthington, and people don't realize, I think we've had this conversation online. I've had this conversation online with some people, and like, I walk with him every single day. And like one day in January, the weather was so bad that our umbrella actually turned inside out. And because there was wind and rain, like cold rain, and this other kid's umbrella went like sailing into the carpool lane, and like he started screaming and crying, and it was just chaotic. And my son like started running home because he was terrified. And it's just really some days the weather is just very bad. So I mean, that was a day that the weather was just horrible because it was windy and rainy and cold.
Yeah.
But
I'm gonna just stop you there because I have 3 more questions and we're almost
yeah,
at the
so
end
I'm
of our
gonna,
meeting.
yeah, okay, bye. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you for
Sarah, Pan, go ahead.
So I have two questions. I heard from my friend that during the 2021 to 2022 school year, which that year she was in middle school, that her bus got taken away. And for reference, she lived like 1.4 miles, and this was taken from Google Maps away from the school. And I was wondering if there was a certain policy passed during that year modifying the bus guidelines, and if so, how much it changed from like an older policy. And my second question is, do you know how effective changing the contractor will be in addressing the bus driver shortages?
Oh, wow. So in 2021, there was a very minor policy change to policy 5200. That's the transportation policy that determines which kids get school buses and which kids don't. There was not any increase to the transportation radius. What's interesting about that year's policy is they went through formal review, and they also had a public hearing for this minor policy change. They had a public hearing. So one person showed up and basically said, I'm glad you changed glad to happy. And that was it. And they changed the policy. And this was a very significant one. And they never went through that process. They'd never invited the public to the decision-making process. So your friend is probably lost her bus service because of something called coordination of services, where can I ask, was the 1.4 miles for high school, or do you know what grade level your friend was
Um, at that time, she was in 8th grade.
in 8th grade? So she lost it while she was a middle schooler,
I think so.
and the walking path was 1.4 miles last year.
I took the car path from Google Maps, so I'm not sure
Okay.
if
So
there's
they're
a
not using
different
the car path. You can use the walk math on Google Maps is a pretty good estimate. They have some fancier program that they use for more exact calculations than Google Map, but Google Maps pretty good for your walking distance. If you do the car distance, because of the way, like they may require you to use a Columbia Association path, for example, and that wouldn't be a car path. And so that could change. So the old policy was 1 mile for middle schoolers. So my suspicion is it was 1.4 miles looking at a map, because it was including a walking path that wasn't a driving path. The other thing, I'm sorry, going back to what I was starting to talk about with coordination of services, is a lot of, because the school doesn't want to pay for as many school buses. School bus is usually the second most expensive thing in a school budget. So salaries are going to be, your staff salaries is going to be the biggest bite out of your budget, out of most budgets in the United States. The second biggest is going to be your transportation budget for most school districts. So they're always looking for ways not to cover as many, for better or worse. And so one of the things that they do is they do have a lot of hazard buses. And again, those are the buses that go to homes where there's not a safe walking route to school. And they say, well, if we create the small walking path from this distance to this distance, then we think it's safe enough. Or we add this crosswalk and this crossing guard. And so over the last few years, the transportation office has been doing that, where they've been coordinating with the county. They've been adding small safety improvements and then cutting school bus services after. So if your friend lost school bus service in 2021, it was probably related to recognition that there was a new safety measure that was physically in place, where the transportation office felt it was safe enough, and then they took away the hazard bus that used to go there.
We have another question from Emily.
I was just wondering, and sorry if you addressed this already, but when did the school system inform the public about this whole transportation situation, and how much did they tell everyone? Because what I'm noticing is that for policies that would have a lot of pushback from the public, they often don't give much information away about what they're doing. Like with the teacher cuts, just a month ago, I think, they weren't even going to tell some of the teachers that their position had been cut until they've already made the decision. I don't think they had many public hearing opportunities for that either. So I was just wondering how much they told the public?
Yeah, so I'm an informed parent who tries to read all of those emails that the school sends us. They send a lot of emails. There was no public hearing for this policy change. So the board voted in May of 2022. Prior to that, if you were not watching school board meetings, you would not have been invited to the decision-making process. You wouldn't have even known. And so there was one person that spoke that night during public forum. And I encourage you all to be aware of this because I certainly didn't know this, is that at any school board meeting, most school board meetings, you can go and talk about any topic that you want to for 3 minutes. It's called public forum. You can stand up and say, I don't like this about the school, or I love this about the school. Let's keep doing this. It's great. You have 3 minutes to speak your mind. And there was one person who had been following the minutes or maybe was somehow otherwise an insider. And he spoke against the policy. And he said, it's an inauspicious start to such a drastic change to not invite the public to the conversation. And he was so right. I only know that because I went back as I've been trying to figure out how they did this and when they did this, that I was watching the meeting from that night. So I would agree. They didn't want our opinion. They didn't want, and that's concerning. That's a big problem, especially when their own policy 2020 describes that the sound decision-making relies in part on public input. They didn't receive it here. So we found out as people, the public was informed by emails sent to families labeled non-transportation areas for the 23-24 school year. They were designed for the messaging was designed for a very educated native speaker. So even within our current communities, we think there are people who do not understand what's happening to the school bus cuts. Those were released at the end of March of this year. And it's been challenging. So March, everyone was about to head to spring break. That's when they released the information because they had a whole week not to respond to emails. And they had a whole week that was very hard for us. We immediately found out and started to advocate for change pretty quickly on. And it's very hard to organize people when people are leaving on vacation. And then you come back from spring break and it's the end of the school year and there's all the end of the school year activities. And so again, it's very hard to organize grassroots movements when and I think they know that. I think they did that knowing that it would be easier to silence an issue that they didn't want to talk about publicly. Oh, and I'm sorry, in the previous question, I think it was a 2 question. There was a question of would the California-based company help address the driver shortage? The driver shortage, so they're basically trying to recruit current drivers that work for local bus contractors. They've advertised saying you could keep your same bus route if you come to us and use our buses and get managed by our company. So it's not clear that they're inventing new drivers. They are recruiting and they're trying to recruit and hire new drivers and train new drivers, but it's not clear to me that they have some novel strategy that local contractors don't have access to. And some local bus drivers are so loyal to their current contractors that they are either leaving the profession altogether, retiring, or going into another driving type position because they feel like it's distasteful to work for a different company. And that's a shame for we need more bus drivers.
And Paul has a question. That's the last question.
Yeah, thanks for a great presentation, very informative. I have a quick question, especially considering time considerations. Have you had any success reaching out to, say, concerned teachers, for example, through the Howard County Education Association?
I have not reached out to the Howard County Education Association. It has felt that's a good idea, actually. I have found that some PTAs have wanted to be vocal, and it has taken a while for them to organize and express their concerns. And I have found that some PTAs, well, it's also summer now, have either been hard to reach or my own PTA didn't want to talk about it. And it's unfortunate because to me, I'm not advocating for my school, I'm advocating for children of this county. And I think that each PTA needs to think about that when they're choosing whether or not to speak. So if only, I know Phelps Luck Elementary School is speaking out against it. They had 20 people show up at the Board of Education meeting a few weeks ago, mostly Spanish speaking families, and they had a translator when they were during their public forum presentation. And I feel like even if even if you find talking about something that's political in nature to be a little distasteful, I do feel like if you think that children are being harmed by a policy, that you should consider speaking out. So I'm a little disappointed that some PTAs have chosen to not speak about this issue. I'm continuing to, reach out to PTAs. I did not reach out directly to the Howard County Education Association. If there's other recommendations, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to. I've written so many letters, I've lost count. I've made so many calls, I've lost count. I've talked to so many people, I've lost count. So I'm willing to at least bring it up. If people keep pushing back, I'm not the sort that's going to harass people.
I think teachers would be concerned. I'm a former teacher. You want your students to get to school and not miss school.
Sure.
The thought of a situation where a kid has an excuse like, I can't walk, it's raining, it's snowing, would be ridiculous. So I would reach out to them.
Yeah.
For sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the
Thank you
presentation.
for inviting me. It was a pleasure to see you all and meet you. You have a lovely group here. It's nice to hear your ideas and your discussions.
Well, we hope you'll join our group, and that's what we're going to have our little slide. Let me show you our last slide.